Today, we're diving into a story about how a nation was really forced to look itself in the mirror. We're talking about the American Civil Rights Movement from about 1954 to 1968. It's an incredible story of how regular people, ordinary citizens, used nonviolent protest to tear down a whole system of racial segregation, a system that had been entrenched for almost 100 years. So, how'd they do it? Let's get into it.
So that's really the core question, isn't it? I mean, how do you change a nation? How does a group of people who've been systematically denied any real power actually force an entire country to rewrite its laws and face up to its ugliest prejudices? Well, the answer starts with really, truly understanding what they were fighting against.
All right, so let's set the stage. To get a real grip on the movement, you first have to understand the world it was born into. And believe me, this wasn't just about, changing some people's opinions. This was about taking apart a massive, deeply rooted legal and social system called Jim Crow.
So what exactly was Jim Crow? Well, think of it as this sprawling web of laws and social rules that were designed systematically to strip African Americans of their basic human rights. It controlled everything: where you could live, where you could work, where you could eat, even where you went to school. It literally created two different Americas, one for white people and a completely separate and profoundly unequal one for everyone else.
And here's the really crazy part. This whole system wasn't just some local custom. Nope, it had the stamp of approval from the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. Back in 1896, a decision called Plessy versus Ferguson came down, and it created this powerful legal fantasy called separate but equal. But let's be real, in practice, it was anything but equal. It was basically a green light for states to enforce separation and guarantee inequality.
Jim Crow really had two faces. On one hand, you had the day-to-day humiliation, the signs telling you which water fountain you could use, which door you could walk through. But there was always something darker lurking just beneath the surface: the constant, terrifying threat of brutal violence. This wasn't just peer pressure. This was control enforced by pure terror, and its most horrific expression was lynching. So, when you put it all together, you see this wasn't just a random collection of unfair rules. It was a total system of oppression, built on four main pillars. You had racial segregation, which meant separate and always worse schools, hospitals, everything. Then you had disenfranchisement, things like poll taxes and impossible literacy tests designed to make sure black citizens couldn't vote. Add to that economic exploitation, which locked people into poverty, and finally, that constant threat of systemic violence to keep everyone in line. It was suffocating. Okay, so by the time we get to the 1950s, something had to give. You've got decades of resistance building up, you've got black soldiers coming home after fighting for freedom in World War II, only to find none at home. The pressure was just becoming unbearable. And a couple of key events were about to light a fuse and crack the whole foundation of Jim Crow wide open.
And the first major crack? It came from the Supreme Court, the same institution that had enabled Jim Crow in the first place. In 1954, in the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the court made a unanimous decision. They ruled that segregating children in public schools was flat out unconstitutional. This was a direct shot at that whole separate but equal idea that had been the law of the land for more than half a century.
But what's so powerful about this ruling is the reasoning behind it. Chief Justice Earl Warren, he wrote that separating children based on race creates a feeling of inferiority that could damage their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. So, you see, the court wasn't just changing a law. It was making a huge statement about the deep psychological harm that segregation causes.
So if the Brown decision was the legal spark, what came next was the emotional explosion. Just a year later in 1955, a 14-year-old boy from Chicago named Emmett Till was visiting family in Mississippi, and he was brutally, horribly murdered. His supposed crime? Allegedly offending a white woman. Basically, breaking one of the unwritten deadly rules of Jim Crow.
What happened next, though, is what changed the course of history. Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, made an unbelievably brave choice. She insisted on an open casket funeral, saying she wanted the world to see what I have seen. And when magazines like Jet published the photos of her son's battered body, it sent an absolute shockwave across the country. For so many people, especially outside the South, this was the first time they were forced to see the raw, sickening reality of this kind of racial hatred.
And the impact was immediate. Just think about this. Only 100 days after Emmett Till's murder, A woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And she herself later said that when she made that decision, she was thinking about Emmett Till. The connection between that raw grief and this act of defiance is just so direct and incredibly powerful.
Okay, so now you have all this anger and this new determination, but it needed a strategy, and the strategy they landed on was nonviolent direct action. Now, don't let the word nonviolent fool you. This was anything but passive. It was a highly disciplined, incredibly courageous, and super strategic way of confronting injustice head-on. It was all about creating maximum impact.
So let's take a look at the sit-in. This wasn't just a bunch of people showing up and sitting down. No way. It was planned down to the smallest detail. Protesters were trained to dress professionally, like in their Sunday best. They were told to sit quietly at a segregated lunch counter. And the absolute most important rule, do not retaliate. No matter what was done to them, no matter what was said to them, they would not fight back. The whole point was to expose the ugliness of the other side.
And then in 1960, we saw this theory put into action in a huge way. 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, walked into a Woolworth's, sat down at the whites-only lunch counter, and very politely asked to be served. That simple, quiet act of defiance, it lit a match. It sparked a wave of similar protests that just spread like wildfire all across the South.
But this strategy of peace was met with pure savagery. When groups of activists called the Freedom Riders got on interstate buses to challenge segregation in travel, they faced unimaginable violence. We're talking about mobs firebombing their buses, brutally beating them, often while police just stood by and watched. And it was this stark contrast, these calm, well-dressed, peaceful protesters being met with such insane violence that got broadcast on TV screens across America and around the world. People couldn't ignore it anymore.
And the amount of sacrifice this took, it's just immense. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott. After Rosa Parks was arrested, 50,000 African-American citizens in Montgomery refused to ride the city buses. For 381 days, that's more than a year. They walked, they set up carpools, they just kept going. That level of sheer determination is what finally forced the Supreme Court to step in and rule that bus segregation was unconstitutional.
So after a decade of this kind of sacrifice, this brilliant strategy, and this relentless struggle, the pressure on the federal government was just enormous. The moral high ground of the movement was impossible to deny. The whole country was watching. The whole world was watching. Washington had no choice but to finally act.
And when the dam finally broke, the legislative victories started rolling in one after another. 1964 brought the big one, the Civil Rights Act, a massive law that banned segregation in public places and discrimination in hiring. Then, just a year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came along and tore down all those barriers like literacy tests that had kept black people from voting for generations. And then in 1968, the Fair Housing Act targeted segregation in where people could buy or rent a home. It was a whirlwind.
So when you put all those laws together, what does it mean? It means they achieved their main goal. They completely shattered the legal structure of Jim Crow. It was gone. For the first time since the period right after the Civil War, the federal government was actually doing its job, protecting the civil rights of all of its citizens.
But that brings us right back to where we started. How do you change a nation? Well, the laws were changed, for sure. The signs came down. A nation was undeniably transformed. But as the movement itself quickly learned, getting rid of a system of laws isn't quite the same thing as getting rid of inequality. And that question, the one about how to achieve true equality, well, that's a question and a struggle that is still very much with us today.